This year is the 25th anniversary of the iconic South Park movie, South Park Bigger, Longer and Uncut. It's actually wild to think that South Park got a movie just 2 years after the show had premiered on Comedy Central, and the show has continued for an additional 25 years since the film hit theaters. But even more remarkably, Bigger, Longer and Uncut remains one of South Park's most impressive and celebrated stories. Despite the fact that the show has evolved significantly and gained far more notoriety in years since, the South Park movie is possibly, at least in my opinion, the greatest story that the series has ever produced. And even more impressive is the way Matt and Trey went about making the movie, refusing to give into the studio system and making a movie that they wanted to make. It's only because of that attitude that Bigger, Longer and Uncut became such a massive success and is still celebrated to this day. So today, let's look back at one of South Park's earliest and greatest successes, Bigger, Longer and Uncut. So y'all might realize that I have to watch a lot of TV for the work I do on this channel, and that often requires signing up for new streaming services to watch new shows and movies, and that often means that I quickly forget I'm signed up for a new streaming service. But that's where today's sponsor Rocket Money has been a massive help. Rocket Money is an amazing personal finance app that will manage your money and make the changes you need to achieve financial freedom. Thanks to this app, I never forget what subscriptions I'm paying for. It allows me to see the entirety of my budget split up into convenient categories, and when I am paying for a subscription that I've forgotten about, I can cancel it straight through the Rocket Money app. You can analyze your spending habits to manage your budget, and it will even automatically deposit savings for you if you need help to start saving up. It's seriously such a great tool for budgeting and keeping track of your finances. To take control of your finances today, go to rocketmoney.com/Johnny2Cellos or click the link in the description and start taking control of your financial life. That link again is rocketmoney.com/Johnny2Cellos. There are so many things that are ingenious about the story told in Bigger, Longer and Uncut, but none of these things would have been possible if it weren't for Matt and Trey's sort of punk rock attitude when it came to producing the film. At this point, South Park had only been around for a couple of years, but fascinatingly, Matt and Trey sort of thought that their time in Hollywood was coming to an end, which obviously sounds hilarious now that they're approaching their 27th season of South Park. But because of the way the cultural reaction to the show had trended, with huge fanfare during the first season and a bit of a muted to negative reaction to the second season, they just fully expected that the movie would be the horse they rode into the sunset.
And I think we were like, okay, swan song, we're going out with a bang, we're gonna put it all in this movie.
But there was also this attitude of like, we don't care. Like, our careers are over, the show is over, we're gonna do what we want to do, and we don't care what bridges we burn.
And it was because of this attitude that the movie turned out the way it did at all, because at nearly every turn, Matt and Trey had to fight to make the movie they wanted to make, starting with the mere fact that they wanted to make an R-rated movie while Paramount wanted the film to be PG-13.
And they literally had graphs.
Yeah, and they had graphs and like
easels.
See, a PG-13 can get into these markets and this and do that later on cable, and an R-rated could do this and that. And then the other guy at Paramount would go, hold on a second. Are you actually trying to tell me that because it can do this on cable, it'll make more money there? And he's like, that's right, Jim.
Obviously, if Matt and Trey had any interest or expectation that they would be sticking around Hollywood, these would have been harder decisions for them to make. But in their minds, they had already gamed the system and gotten far more than they had ever expected to. They wanted to keep their integrity intact and make a movie that they were proud of. And there were some truly embarrassing expectations from the studio, including a baffling attempt to do a Kid Rock tie-in music video.
And they were like, no, we can get Kid, and he'll do this. He actually recorded a song last year that we're just going to use that, and make a video. And we were just like, you don't understand. That's so anti-South Park.
So lame.
Don't do that. Please don't do that.
And this wasn't even the only argument over music. Bigger, Longer and Uncut is a musical after all. Trey has always been a genuine fan of musicals, and Matt and Trey's first film that they made together in college was called Alfred Packer the Musical, later renamed Cannibal the Musical. Since South Park was this subversive R-rated animated comedy, they got the idea to parody the popular musical films of the time, which were of course the films of the Disney Renaissance. But aside from those massive Disney productions, at that time, musicals weren't exactly a popular format for any film.
And this was when musicals were just like the kiss of death.
So this was also a big fight with the studio, and when you look at the press and marketing for the South Park movie, there is absolutely no indication that it was going to be a musical, which is very funny given that its musical numbers are something that makes it stand out as such an excellent film. These studio arguments even went as far as the trailer edits, with Matt and Trey strongly disagreeing on how Paramount wanted to market the film.
And they did one of these trailers that is just, I mean, complete. It makes my skin crawl.
It's like, get ready for the wacky woke fun of summer.
This conflict escalated truly about as far as it possibly could have, threatened litigation because of a stunt that Stone pulled in defiance, as the crews were working desperately to finish the trailer in time to put it in front of Austin Powers.
But they needed this one tape, this thing called a DLT, right? The thing that stores the shots. So the PA's walking out with the DLT to go to Paramount to deliver it, so they have their 48 hours. And I was like, bring that over here. And we were on the shoot for Brian Boitano. I stuck it in my trunk of my car and I drove home.
I said it before, but this anti-authority sort of punk rock attitude is ultimately what allowed this movie to become the incredibly unlikely final product that it was. I mean, how else would anyone get a crudely animated R-rated musical comedy into theaters in 1999? And this attitude even shaped a lot of the comedy thanks to their tussles with the MPAA as well. Matt and Trey have long been on record as truly hating the MPAA, mostly stemming back to when they gave their film Orgasmo an NC-17 rating, with absolutely no specific notes on how they can drop the film to an R rating. But thanks to their sort of devious and mischievous nature, they had their own subtle ways to push back against the MPAA when they were told to cut a joke.
So just to kind of piss them off, we put in something way, way worse and send it back. And they come back and be like, oh, okay, that's fine.
Seriously, every time they approved it.
Their issues with the MPAA and censorship in general would obviously also permeate the script and story deeply, but we'll get to that when we dive into the film itself. But all of their defiance and insistence on their own vision paid off, because by just about every metric, South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut was a success. It made about 4 times its budget, a huge feat for an R-rated comedy in 1999, and it got very strong reviews, almost begrudgingly from critics.
It's really weird. We got great reviews in like Time and Newsweek, so we're really sure we did something wrong, because I don't know what, they usually hate us.
And perhaps least expected of all, the film got an Oscar nomination for Best Original Song for Blame Canada, which was bizarrely performed by Robin Williams at the ceremony.
They're not even a real country anyway.
The song would of course lose to Phil Collins. The entire production of this film was just sort of a miracle, born from Matt and Trey's expectation that it truly was their swan song in Hollywood. They made the film on their terms, at least to the fullest extent that they possibly could have, and it's incredibly difficult to argue with the result. A film that is outrageously hilarious, a genuinely good musical, a scathing criticism of the very censorship and outrage they themselves were the subject of, all while remaining sweet and touching for the characters who are grounded throughout this ridiculous story, which I think is as good a time as any to dive into that story. The absolute genius of the South Park movie is how beautifully it mirrors South Park's own journey in the mid to late 90s. The series itself got a bunch of backlash for its crude and outrageous humor, with people arguing whether a cartoon with such vulgarity should even exist, especially if kids are going to be drawn to watch it.
I don't like South Park because I think that it is adult humor, adult off-color humor under the guise of a appearance of a children's television show. And I think that's the entrapment. I think there's a certain amount of entrapment is there.
This became the entire idea behind the film itself. Obviously, South Park is an adult animated series. It is intended for mature audiences. And yet, these outraged groups insist that it should not exist because kids will want to watch it. And that is the entire inciting incident for South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut. The entire opening number is this very sweet musical introduction to South Park and its characters, containing no real vulgarity or obscenities, as all the kids gather to go see this new movie, Terrence and Phillip Asses of Fire, an R-rated film. After sneaking their way in, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut properly introduces the true nature of its vulgarity through Asses of Fire. So the first time the audience is hearing some of the most obscene dialogue in the film, so are the kids.
You're such a pig Philip! What did he say?
If I can get anecdotal for a moment, my first experience watching South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut was actually sort of miraculously poetic. I was too young to see it when it was released in theaters, but in 2003, Comedy Central started doing something called Secret Stash. This was a late-night block of programming where they would actually air uncut and uncensored movies in their entirety. I somehow managed to catch the very first Comedy Central Secret Stash playing, you guessed it.
And now, Comedy Central Secret Stash movie, South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut.
Now, even though these Secret Stash blocks were prompted with a very clear notice every single time it came back from commercial claiming that the programs were uncut, at the time, the idea that cable could play an R-rated movie without massively editing or censoring it was something that my brain simply did not comprehend. So when I began watching the South Park movie, I was thinking, well, even though it's going to be censored on TV, I'll finally get to see this thing. So when Terrence calls Philip a pig fucker, I genuinely had the exact same reaction that the boys did in the film itself. Shock, amazement, excitement. The exact thing they were conveying for these characters is what I was feeling, giving me probably the most perfect first viewing experience of the film I possibly could have had. But that attitude that South Park was met with when it was released, this idea that a cartoon shouldn't deal in these vulgarities because it has a responsibility to children, is exactly the idea that this film critiques. And I think they're right to do so. Besides the still frustratingly prevalent belief that animation is strictly for children, no matter what the medium, kids will always want to watch things that are above their maturity level. It is simply the nature of growing up. And so, it is on the parents to know what their kids are watching and whether or not they are at a maturity level in which they are prepared for what they're seeing.
That's sort of the point of the whole movie, is that the parents need to deal with the kids. You know, they're gonna hear, your kids are gonna hear these things. Your kids are gonna see these things, whether it's from this movie or out on the playground or wherever. And so trying to put them in this bubble isn't going to work.
This is, of course, exactly what the angry naysayers were arguing against back in the late 90s when South Park made its initial splash.
So, to blame the parents for, allowing the kids to watch these programs, this stuff is pouring into the house the way mail comes in through my mailbox.
And so, even in the writing process, Matt and Trey are directly addressing the critics of the time who said the show is a blight on society and shouldn't be allowed, because the villains of the film are the parents who go ballistic when they learn the kind of language their kids are now using after seeing Terrence and Philip, refusing to take any responsibility for how they've raised their kids and instead claiming that they've been corrupted by this Canadian cartoon. That's what the most iconic song, Blame Canada, is all about. The parents completely skirting any blame in what their kids have learned and instead finding a scapegoat.
Don't blame me for my son Stan. He saw the darn cartoon and now he's off to join the Klan.
I just can't express how much I love that this thing is essentially making a perfect case for its own existence within the text of the film. It's so expertly crafted, and it's also just the perfect level of meta. Not to mention the way the narrative metatextually slams the MPAA's bizarre censorship standards. Matt and Trey obviously had a very bad experience dealing with the MPAA, but they were particularly struck by their simultaneous obsession with language and seeming indifference to violence, which is exactly how they crafted Sheila and the other parents as the villains. Characters that are so obsessed with trying to stop their kids from hearing any naughty language that they quite literally wage war on another country. Sheila executes Terrence and Philip, commits actual murder because she's upset by swear words. There could not be a more perfect metaphor for MPAA standards. The film also plays with what at the time was already probably the most iconic aspect of the series, or at least the most well-known and oft-repeated catchphrase.
Oh my God! They've killed Kenny!
While Kenny dying was obviously just a fun repeating gag in the series, they actually used Kenny's death in this film as not only one of the catalysts for the plot, with his death being the last straw for Sheila and the other parents to start taking action against Asses of Fire, but they also give Kenny an incredible and vitally important subplot in hell after he dies. Kenny has an entire afterlife arc in this film, elevating the "You Killed Kenny" gag into a full story for the first time in the franchise's history. I think one of the most underrated aspects of the film is the fact that despite coming out a couple years after the series, it still acts as a perfect introduction to the world. You don't have to have seen the show to appreciate the movie. It properly introduces every character and the setting. It doesn't rely on the expectation that the audience knows South Park going in, which makes it a much more complete film. And this is in large part due to how incredible the music is. The opening number, Mountain Town, walks the audience straight through South Park, introducing every important aspect of the upcoming story, from the character characters to setting to theme, starting with Stan, who is really introduced by his mother.
What an angel with a heart so sweet and sure, and a mind so open and pure.
This also introduces the idea that at least some of the parents see these kids as these perfect, sweet little innocent angels, that in their mind, they could not possibly do anything wrong, that there's nothing that could corrupt them, which is a perfect juxtaposition to the introduction of our villain, Sheila Broflovsky. Sheila demands that Kyle takes his brother Ike with him.
Do as I say, Kyle! Okay, I'm sorry.
This introduces the dynamic between Kyle and his mother, and the fact that Sheila doesn't communicate particularly well with her son. Rather than going deeper and talking to Kyle about his belief that Ike isn't his quote-unquote real brother because he's adopted, she simply yells at him to do what she says. This is the sort of authoritarian mindset Sheila embodies. Do what I say, why doesn't matter. Whereas a better parent might actually have a real conversation with their child. This is followed by the laying out of Sheila's explicit worldview, the fear that leads her down the path of villainy in the film, describing the boys as frail and fragile.
The world is such a rotten place.
Sheila sees the world as the problem. She's already skirting responsibility as a parent because she fears the way the world might corrupt those kids. They also even foreshadow Kenny's entire subplot through his mother in this opening sequence.
You go ahead and miss church, and then when you die and go to hell, you can answer to Satan.
And of course, even the wrap-up of the song as they approach the movie theater perfectly sets up the conflict as they sing, "The movies teach us what our parents don't have time to say." This is all literally 4 minutes into the movie. Through a single musical sequence, the characters are introduced, the town of South Park is explored, the villain is set up, and countless other aspects of the film are teased and foreshadowed. It is just a perfect opening number. One of the reasons the music works so well for this film is because Matt and Trey brought in musician Mark Shaman, who just has an unfathomable number of music credits in film, TV, and theater.
And so he brought this whole like Broadway legitimacy and Broadway kind of feel to that.
He took my dinky little songs and turned them into like something that sounded like a real, legitimate song.
And personally, I think this is probably the South Park movie's biggest success. It is an undeniably excellent musical on basically every level. And these days, that might not be so surprising since Matt and Trey have gone on to win 9 Tonys for their Broadway musical Book of Mormon, but I think Bigger, Longer, and Uncut's outstanding soundtrack is possibly the biggest reason this film is so beloved. It is filled with bangers and earworms. In fact, the one disappointment I have in making this video is that I can't play more clips of these songs without having copyright issues, because for me, they are the absolute highlight of the film on an entertainment level. But not only are the songs amazing earworms, basically every single one of them is foundationally important to the story at hand.
Basically every song in the movie pushes the plot forward.
It's Easy MK is the one exception that sort of proves the rule here, which is a super funny song, but doesn't exactly propel the story forward within the song itself. The rest of the songs, however, all do. I already laid out just what makes the opening number work so damn well, but even just as far as the straightforward plot goes, it gets the boys to the movies to see Terrence and Phillip. The second song, which is in the Asses of Fire movie, is the song that teaches the boys all of the curse words initially. Blame Canada firmly establishes Sheila as the film's villain and showcases her motivations for her actions as well as her intentions moving forward. Following this, she arrests Terrence and Phillip, which leads to Canada bombing the Baldwins.
All the Baldwins are dead?
Which leads to America declaring war on Canada. This leads to the one song that was repurposed from the show, Kyle's Mom's a Bitch, which is overheard by Sheila and ends with the parents putting the V-chip in Cartman. What Would Brian Boitano Do motivates the kids to fight back against their parents and do what's right. La Resistance further radicalizes the kids and moves their plan into action. Though I do think my favorite song in the entire film, and probably in all of South Park, is Up There, which is basically the Disney-style I Want song sung by Satan himself. And I'm not the only one who likes this song the most either.
Trey, your favorite part from the South Park movie?
My favorite part?
Yeah.
I think it's the Satan song, actually. Because it's such the Disney moment,
Yes.
such a, blackened Disney moment.
Just on its face, this is very funny. The idea that this all-important I Want song is sung by Satan. And it's funny because it's so subversive, but I think what makes it effective is how incredibly genuine the song is. You would think that going into this film that Satan is the villain, but he's not. Sheila is the villain of the primary A story, and the villain of Kenny and Satan's B story is actually Saddam Hussein, whom Satan is in a relationship with. You actually empathize with and feel bad for Satan because he's in this abusive relationship with Saddam. Throughout his time in hell, Kenny tries his best to comfort Satan and convince him to leave this awful person.
You're right. I should leave him.
But of course, Saddam's manipulative nature gets the best of Satan with his song I Can Change, which of course motivates Satan to continue hell's invasion of Earth. This thing is just so well written and so well crafted, but I think there's one thing at the very core of the film that makes it work beyond all else. Beyond the outrageous humor and vulgarity, beyond the incredible music, it's that at the core of this film, there's a genuine emotional story, even when that empathy you're feeling is sometimes pointed towards Satan.
What we really achieved in the movie is that as dark and twisted as it gets, there's sort of this underlying sweetness to the whole thing, and you kind of leave there going, that's a nice little musical, you know?
As I mentioned earlier, up to this point, Kenny had primarily been a punchline in the show, but he's the character who's actually given the pivotal emotional moment in the movie, the storyline with the most impact on the climax of the film. After being denied from entering heaven and entering hell instead, Kenny's support of Satan through his relationship with Saddam is what later motivates Satan to make the right decision and end things with him. And because of that support, Satan allows Kenny a wish. Kenny's characterization would later be more firmly established as selfless, but this was one of the earliest and biggest moments for the character to set that standard, as he wishes things back to the way they were before Satan came to Earth, effectively sacrificing himself for the good of his friends, but not before they give him this touching moment with his friends.
Goodbye, you guys.
Finally revealing Kenny's face in, at the time, his most important character moment. Fun fact, Kenny was actually voiced by King of the Hill creator and friend of South Park, Mike Judge. But if these moments didn't land, the movie wouldn't have been nearly as impactful. That emotional hook grounds the story in human emotion, and the characters all get their happy endings. Cartman uses the combo of cursing and his V-chip to beat down Saddam, Kyle stands up to his mother, Stan tells Wendy how he feels about her. The movie sticks the landing because of these moments. But I think one of the most interesting things about the film's success is that the movie still feels like old South Park. It's really old South Park at its absolute finest, but so many of the characters and aspects of the show that would become vitally important later in the series are just nowhere to be found in the film.
It's weird to think that right now the movie that defines South Park doesn't even have Butters in it.
Butters, Tolkien, Jimmy, Timmy, Towley, so many of the most iconic characters in the show's history either were not characters yet or didn't have a speaking role in the film. Even Randy basically just appears as a part of the chorus of dads supporting Mothers Against Canada, which is just inconceivable based on how that character is used today. I personally think that South Park needed to evolve and change and introduce new ideas in order to continue the way that it has, but South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut represents the absolute peak of what South Park was originally. It maintains the spirit of those original seasons, but puts it in the best possible package that spirit could have been delivered in. These days, Matt and Trey actually seem to feel mostly negatively about the movie. When they did the Blu-ray commentary for the film in 2009, they had a ton of regrets and even struggled to watch parts of it.
Look how junky the animation is.
Yeah, it's pretty hard for me to look at.
They spend a huge part of this commentary lamenting some of their creative decisions, even regretting how hard they had previously ripped on George Lucas for changing parts of Star Wars, realizing that they have the same desire to fix their past work. Personally, I think the simplistic animation has so much charm. The movie definitely looks better than the show did at the time. I particularly love the construction paper textures on everything, even though the film was made digitally. It actually makes the South Park movie stand out visually from just about everything else in the South Park canon. It adds a bit more depth and character than the show had at the time, even still in its simpler animation, but it also doesn't showcase the kinds of more advanced animation that they're capable of these days. Just another thing that makes the film such a unique and standout South Park project. And while Matt and Trey may have a lot of regrets about the South Park movie, I think the continued adoration of the film is proof that it turned out exactly the way it was meant to. They even managed to fill up theaters everywhere for the recent 25th anniversary screenings. The film is beloved for good reason, and to this day, no other South Park episode or special or video game quite makes me feel the way the South Park movie does. Part of that is the nostalgic memories I have attached to it from watching it for the first time, and part of that is because it's simply an excellent movie. Structured immaculately from top to bottom, filled with incredible music, biting comebacks to their most ardent critics, outrageous humor, and emotional depth, it is all around some of the most fun I've ever had watching a movie. I don't think there will ever be another film quite like South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut.
Johnny!
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.